Hello, welcome to Budget Beauty, where I help you look flawless for less. Hello, welcome back to Budget Beauty, and a special welcome if you're new here. My name is Jen, and we are all about beauty on a budget. A little over 30 days ago, maybe 35, 40 days ago, I put out a video called 30 Palettes in 30 Days. Using my palettes, shopping my stash, palettes I've never used, or palettes that I haven't used in a very long time. I wanted to be able to use my palettes that I have on hand and shop my stash, so I did just that over the course of the last 30 plus days. I took a photo of the look that I created with all 30 palettes so that you can not only see the palette, but see the look that I was able to create. And let me just tell you how good it felt to use these 30 palettes. Hashtag 30 palettes in 30 days was such a fun challenge that I definitely can see myself doing this again in the future. And I revisited some old palettes that I kind of forgot about and that I re-fell in love with. So I'm going to share with you today, again, the 30 palettes that I used over the last 30 plus days, share the look that I created with you, and give you some feedback on my thoughts on the palette, especially if I had never used it until this challenge. So let's dive into this bin of 30 palettes. So the first palette that I created a look with is the Jaclyn Hill X Morphe, or her Volume 1 palette, the original Jaclyn Hill palette. This was the very first eyeshadow palette I purchased when I got back into using eyeshadow. And I have to say that I really loved using this palette again. It is such a great palette. We have neutrals, we have color. There's literally a little bit of something for everyone. These shades blend beautifully. And again, I remembered how much I truly love this palette and why this was the first eyeshadow palette that I purchased. And I'm going to be putting this in my top drawer, so I definitely continue to get more use out of it. Now, the second palette I dove into was the Jaclyn Hill X Morphe Volume 2 palette. Now, like I mentioned in that video, I gravitate towards her first palette more, and I've actually used this a couple of times, and let me just tell you how much I loved the look that I created with this palette. I love these bottom two rows here, these purples, these pinks, along with all of the neutrals. Again, they blend beautifully. The formula of these palettes is 10 out of 10. Again, this is a palette that after using it, I definitely want to reach for more. The next palette was this palette from Do Color that I actually received in a subscription box. Okay, full honesty, full transparency. My look I created with this palette turned out beautifully, but it was a struggle. The struggle bus was fully engaged. It was terrible blending these colors. Putting on one color was fine, but building them up and adding additional colors to it was a complete utter nightmare. Like I said, my look turned out great, but this palette is so hard to use that I know that I definitely won't be reaching for this palette again. So I'm actually going to go ahead and declutter this. I'm glad that I used it. I'm glad that I gave it a shot, but I honestly don't see myself giving it a second chance or reaching for it again. Now, the next palette on my list was the Nabla Cutie palette in Analog. This is the neutral palette from Nabla. I love this palette, especially this middle shade here. This like kind of two colored shimmery shade. This palette is beautiful. It blends beautifully. The shimmer shades are amazing. Really, really liked this. I actually received this in a subscription box, but this is a palette that I am putting in my top drawer that I will be reaching for to create a neutral look. I loved everything about my look and the usability and wearability of the Nabla palette. The next palette that I wore was my Barbie Malibu, is my Barbie X Colourpop Malibu Barbie palette. I love this palette. I've loved this palette since the minute that I got it. It is so fun. It's so vibrant. It's summery. It's very, very easy to use. It wears really well, and there are so many looks you can create with this. Even though it's a vibrant pinky blue palette, there's some neutrals in here as well that make really pretty neutral looks. So love this palette. Love, love, love. I will continue to use this on a regular basis, especially in the spring and summer months. The next palette I reached into for the first time was my Norvina Abh palette. And again, I did receive this in a subscription box. I had never used this palette until I went to create this look. I love this palette. I am very much a color girl. We know this. We know I love my color. These colors are stunning. They blend beautifully. They layer really well. If you want to start with a lighter color and layer them up to deepen them up. I really liked this palette a lot. Now, would I pay $60 for it? No. I'm happy to have it in my collection. I probably won't purchase any of the other Norvina palettes just because $60 is a lot, but I do really like this color story. I really liked this palette. Another palette I used for the very first time was from Alter Ego. This is the Shadow Kiss palette. This is a dupe for the Natasha Denona Glam palette. It is a very cool toned, neutral palette. I really liked this. I don't love cool tones and I don't love neutral eye looks, but the look I created with this, I fell in love with. This palette blends beautifully. Now, I have never tried the Natasha Denona Glam. In fact, I don't own any Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes. I did order the Love palette. It's currently 50% off at the filming of this video on Sephora. So I ordered it to try it out because I hated her Zendo palette. So I'm hoping the Love palette is better, but this palette is a quarter of the price and it worked beautifully. Is the formula the exact same as Natasha Denona? I don't know, but the overall look that I created was the exact same and it's much more affordable. I loved this. I will definitely be purchasing more Alter Ego palettes. The next palette I used is one of my favorites. This is the Sydney Grace X Temptalia collab, and this is the Radiant Reflection palette. I love this palette. I love all of these palettes. The shades in here are so pretty and so unique. The shimmers are a million out of 10. They are so, so, so good. I really like this palette. It's not my favorite out of the three, but I really, really like this, and it was so nice to be able to use this again, and I loved my look. Next up, I created a look with the BH Cosmetics Do Not Disturb palette. I love this palette. This is the only palette from the Say It collection that I purchased. I just love the color story of this. I loved how my look turned out. I thought it was so pretty. I actually received several compliments on my look, and that was the second time I used this palette. I love this. This is a top drawer palette for me. It's a very unique color story to my collection, so couldn't be happier to have this little baby in there. The next palette is from Fluid. This is the Otherworldly palette. I've used this a handful of times. I will say that the look I created with this, you guys loved. I received so many compliments from my subscribers and my followers when I created the look with this. I use this really pretty purpley shade here. It's just such a sparkly, pretty shade, and I used it as a topper over the other shimmer shades, and my look turned out so beautiful. This purple shade right here is well worth this palette all by itself. So this one is a top drawer for me. It's a very unique color story, and I just love everything about it. The next palette I used is the Colourpop Fade Into Hue. Now, this palette is quite controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it. It does contain a wide variety of rainbow colors and a lot of pressed glitters. Now, pressed glitters are something that some people love, some people hate. I don't mind them, especially if I put them down with the glitter glue. And again, the look I created with this, I got a million compliments, and I did use the pressed glitter. I like this palette. I've heard from some people that the quality isn't very good. I don't find that to be the case. I actually really like this palette. It is my favorite rainbow palette in my collection, and this one also sits in my regular top drawer of the palettes that I use the most. Now, another palette that I used for the very first time in this challenge is the Ciate London I Am Woman What's Yours Superpower palette. Now, this is a very neutral palette, so I was excited to get it in my subscription box, but it isn't one that I immediately want to reach for. I will say this was better than expected. I loved my look. I love this whole like rose gold pinky vibe more than I like the neutral colors, but this palette worked really well. The shadows were very easy to use. They lasted all day. I really liked this. Like I said, much better than I thought that I would. These two palettes was probably my favorite day over the last 30 days because these are literally some of my favorite palettes in my collection, and my look I was obsessed with. So I used the Blends Bunny Blends palette. This is an all matte palette. So whenever I use this palette, I pair it with a shimmer palette like the Alien Cosmetics All I Ever Wanted. This is an all shimmer, all multi-chrome duochrome palette, and I just love these two paired together. I use this in my crease and as a transition, and then a shimmer shade on my lid. Love these palettes, love them. Like I said, probably one of my top favorite two palettes in my entire 100+ eyeshadow palette collection. The next look was created with another Alter Ego palette. First time using this. This is the Canyon palette, which is a dupe for the Natasha Denona bronze palette. And once again, I currently don't have any Natasha Denona palettes yet, so I can't really compare the formula, but I would say that the looks that I was able to create with this palette are similar to the ones that I've seen with the bronze palette. And again, this is so affordable. I like this palette, but again, I'm not a neutral person, so this isn't a palette I'm going to reach for all the time. However, when I want a good neutral look that with a palette that performs really well, you can't beat the Alter Ego. Next, I was able to use my ABH or my Anastasia Beverly Hills palette. I love this palette. I bought this on sale with a coupon, and I'm so happy that I did. I just think the color story is absolutely beautiful. This is the only actual ABH palette that I've purchased that's this type of format, this long format. I love this. I love how my look turned out. This blue right here, yes. This glitter right here, yes, yes. Love this palette. Happy to have this in my collection. The next look was created with the Liora X Ofra Collab palette. Like I mentioned in my first video, when I received this palette, I was like, what's up with this color story? This is actually a highlighter, but I use it as an inner corner shade. I love this palette. This is a perfect fall palette. Unfortunately, it's no longer available, but I really like this. This is the only palette I've purchased from Ofra. And even though at first I didn't know about this color story, I've really grown to love it. The colors, they blend really nicely together. Love it. Love, love, love this palette. The next palette is another one of the Sydney Grace Temptalia collection. This is the On the Horizon palette. This is my favorite palette in my 3 palette collection. I just love the grungy greens right here with this really dark, pretty matte brown. I love this palette. Again, loved my look. Another look that I created that I received so many compliments on. Yeah, I love this 3 parts palette series. I recommend all 3 palettes. I really love the Sydney Grace formula. I actually just ordered another Sydney Grace palette because I fell in love with their formula from this collection. Next up, I got to use one of my other favorite palettes. This is the BH Cosmetics Smitten in Switzerland. I love this palette. Every single look I've created with this, no matter what colors I choose, turns out beautifully. This blends beautifully. I paid $8.50 for this palette on sale, and honestly, it's one of my favorites. If you like neutral, but a little bit of color and some cool tones, highly recommend this. Just any of the BH palettes in general are so good. They're so affordable. Another palette I used for the very first time and my first time trying LA Girl palettes in general is the LA Girl Hey Hey Vacay. This is the Under the Palms palette, and this is, again, a neutral color story with some of those really pretty grungy greens. I love this little green quad down here. I really like this palette, and you guys, the LA Girl shadow formula, they're not playing. It is so good. It is so, so good. These are super affordable. I feel like these palettes are $16 or $18. I bought it on Ulta. I love it. I actually purchased 2 of them. You'll see the other one here shortly, but loved my look, loved the formula. Will definitely be purchasing more LA Girl palettes. Next up, I got to use my Laura Lee Los Angeles Nudie Patootie palette. I love this palette. I love the Laura Lee Los Angeles formula. I love the neutral but pinky tone of this palette. It is nude. It is Nudie Patootie. It is called that for a reason. I love this palette. The formula is great. Every look I've ever created with this, I've loved. I love this shade down here, Exposed. This is such a pretty duochrome. Really, really loved this. One of my favorite neutral palettes from Colourpop is the California Love. I actually filmed some videos the day that I used this palette. So many compliments. Once again, actually a few people said this is the favorite look that I've ever created was using this palette. And I used the pressed glitter here. I loved it. I thought it made a really pretty nice topper for my look. I love this palette. Actually, Colourpop's formula has come a long way. It's one of my favorite brands. If you want to see a Colourpop palette ranking video, let me know because I own a lot of their palettes and I would happily rank those from best to worst, but I really like this palette. If you're a neutral lover, this is a great palette to have on hand. I used the Catrice Neon Earth eyeshadow palette for the first time for this challenge, and I had mixed feelings on this. I had read some really bad reviews about the Catrice eyeshadow formula, but I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. I found it to be very workable, very easy to blend. I love the neutral look that I came up with. I was very hesitant because a lot of people said it's a horrible formula. I actually didn't mind the formula at all. Now, will I be purchasing more of these Catrice slim eyeshadow palettes? Probably not. I do like this one though, and if you like a neutral look and you want an affordable palette, I found that this performed really well. Next up is the last palette in the Sydney Grace Tim Talia collection, and this is Quintessence. This is my second favorite palette because I love this, I love this, I love this. This right here is an amazing shifty duochrome. I love the look that I created with this. If I want a more bold, colorful look, kind of like what I'm wearing today, this is a palette that I would definitely reach for because I really, really like the boldness and the brightness of these colors. Just love these 3 palette collection. Like I've said, love it. Next up is one of my other favorite palettes from BH Cosmetics. This is their Avocado Toast palette. Again, the color story of this, a million out of 10. I just love the greens, the pinks. It has neutral, it has color. It's a little grungy. I just really like this palette. And the performance of these shadows is impeccable. So, so good. And like I said, every look I've created with this palette, and I've used this one several times, I've been obsessed with the look. So highly recommend BH Cosmetics in general, but the Avocado Toast and Smitten in Switzerland, in my opinion, are must-haves. The next palette is another Laura Lee Los Angeles. This is her newest release, Candy Skies. This is a pastel palette. Now, if you don't like pastels, you're not gonna like this. This is actually the only pastel palette that I've ever purchased. I love it. I love her formula. This shade Clouds, this duochrome that shifts from blue to green to brown, love it. I've loved all the looks that I've created with this palette. I've used it a handful of times, and for a pastel palette, it has really good color payoff. So if you are in the market for a good pastel palette, highly recommend. Creating the look for this challenge was the second time I've used my Huda Beauty Rose Gold Remastered palette. I like this palette. It's neutral, but it does have these really pretty pops of gold pinks, and this rose gold shimmer is gorgeous. I love this palette. If I want a neutral based palette, this is one that I will definitely reach for. I also love that there's a matte black. You can deepen up your outer corner. I really like this palette. The formula and the workability and wearability is fantastic. Naked palette that I own is the Naked Honey, and I actually bought this primarily because I just love the gold tone of this color story. I think it is so beautiful. This was the second time that I've used this palette, and I'm obsessed with this goldy shimmer shade right here. That's my favorite one. I use that on my lid, and I just love the way that it turns out. Again, if you love neutrals, but you like that pop of gold, that pop of sparkle, I really like this palette. Again, this is the only naked one that I have, and I'm so happy to have this one and the only one in my collection. Here is the second LA Girl palette that I purchased. Again, my first impression, first time using this. This is the Good Times and Tan Lines palette. Now this one is a little bit more colorful. In fact, this is a dupe for the Natasha Denona Zendo palette, the one that I didn't like, that I returned. I did not like that palette at all, but this one performs exquisitely. I love the color story. This whole like orangey teal thing is all the rage, and this palette has it all, and they blend really well. They wear really well. Like I said, I am quite impressed with the LA Girl formula in general. I will definitely be picking up more of their palettes. The next palette I used, first impression, first time, is the Nabla Cutie palette in Midnight. This is the blue palette. Okay, right off the bat, this shade right here is stunning. You can see it shift. It shifts from purple to blue. I love that. And then this other blue shimmer, gorgeous. I want to play around with this again. I liked my look. I didn't love my look. So this is a palette that I'm excited to have and give a second shot to. Next is the Colourpop Cabana Club. This is a fairly new palette from Colourpop. I really like this palette. I like that it has the neutral vibe if you want neutral colors. This shimmer shade right here is amazingly beautiful. This orangey shimmer shade, also amazingly beautiful. Really like this palette. I hemmed and hawed on picking it up. Glad that I have it in my collection. Love how my look turned out. And palette number 30, saving one of the best for last, is the Colourpop Lush Life palette. I am obsessed with this palette. You guys know I love this palette. I've used it so many times. I couldn't wait to use it again. That's how I know I really love a palette, when I have over 100 and I get excited to use a palette for the third, fourth, fifth time. I love this color story. I love the greens, the blues, the pops of pink, the row of neutrals. And what I like is this is done up in rows where you can just go up and down, use those 3 shades and create a pretty look. I think my look turned out beautiful. In fact, this look was one of my favorites that I've created with this palette. And the formula on this, chef's kiss. So that's it. That is hashtag 30 palettes in 30 days challenge. Like I said, I loved getting more use out of these palettes. It was fun to have some first impressions. Most of them I loved, with the exception of the Dew Color palette. Not a fan of that palette, but it was really fun, again, to shop my stash, use my eyeshadow palette collection. And I have to say that over the course of the 30 days that I was using these palettes, I acquired 30 plus new palettes that I haven't used yet. So I definitely need to be digging into those palettes. I have a video coming your way on those palettes. So make sure you're subscribed and your bell is turned on so you don't miss a single video. And give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed this 30-day, 30 palette challenge. Let me know down in the comments if you participated right along with me and which of the looks that I shared with you with these palettes was your favorite. Down in the description box, you'll also find all of the makeup that I'm wearing in today's video. And don't forget to follow me on TikTok for more beauty on a budget. Hashtag 30 palettes in 30 days complete.